All right. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday to you. A wonderful podcast episode that we're here. How many of you watched this episode? I feel like a clinical research nerd, but I have to say this was an entertaining episode. Mitch Hilby, CRPN co-host. How are you doing, Mitch?
Phenomenal. I'm so excited for today. I
Oh my
even
gosh.
dressed up. I brought my TV commercial lawyer bat.
We're here to break the myths, break that. Mitch, what did you think of this episode of CRPN Central?
There was so much alignment between both sides, which is always phenomenal and great to see. But it's really fun when we talk about like fair market value too. I was watching my cousin Vinny not too long ago, and then it made me think. I'm like, I can't remember exactly what that line was, so I looked it up. And his opening statement in court, he's like, everything that guy just said is bullshit. Thank you. I mean, it's kind of relatable, I think, to a degree.
Pretty much. I will tell you this. If I ever thought in my wildest dreams I would include leprechauns and Bigfoot, apples and pineapples, and a third grade teacher giving me a scolding, I never would have believed you. But here we are today talking about it. Wenoah Veikley, Edye Edens, Eric Borchardt. And again, how many times can I say your last name wrong? Let's talk about that too. So before we start, a really big episode. Welcome to CRPN Central, the network dedicated to our sites and our sponsors, free for sites to join, affordable for sponsors, affordable services, and awesome podcasts with awesome guests. Please, let's start by brief introductions. So Wenoah, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Wenoah Veikley. I am the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Clinical Officer at Access Research. Access Health, a small network of sites serving New Mexico, West Texas, in El Paso, and Salt Lake City.
Wow. Wenoah, you are an absolute superstar. And after listening to this podcast, you're my hero. I have to tell you that. Eric, Edye, take a pick. Who's next?
Eric, go ahead.
Okay. Well, Dr. Fox, you did pronounce my name right. It is Eric Borchardt. I'm Associate Director of Clinical Research Financial Compliance at Indiana University. I actually just passed my 10-year anniversary at IU. So I've been working in clinical research finance in different perspectives for 10 years now.
And Edye, go ahead.
Yep. So Edye Edens, regulatory compliance attorney, been in-house at major academic medical centers, done consulting, worked in the tech startup world, and always a fan of the CRPN podcast. Also get to work with Eric in a bunch of different capacities, especially when it relates to billing compliance. So excited to have this particular conversation with this group.
Oh my gosh. So for anyone who didn't get to listen to this, I think I said it before the show, or maybe I did during the show, but I felt like a total clinical research nerd. I listened to this, I laughed and I cried, and I felt happy talking about a topic that is so contentious to so many different people. So for Wenoah, Eric, Edye, when you listen to this podcast, first of all, how did you feel about your interview versus the interview of your counterparts?
I'm going to start with gratitude that I am not living in some mysterious, insane universe all my own, because I tell you, there are so many days when you just think, really, how am I having this conversation again? And am I the only person on the planet having this conversation? I can't be the most expensive, most unrealistic, insanely inflated site in the world. And I think that it is an exercise in, it's almost like some sort of primal therapy where you just get beaten and beaten and beaten and beaten again and again. And eventually you may start believing what you're told. And fortunately, after listening to the podcast, I realized that I am not living in this mystery, magical, unicorn-filled universe all by myself.
Well, it's validating, right? I mean, it's kind of like the first time, I remember the first time I was studying for the bar exam, I actually surprisingly got to the end of law school, graduated and all before somebody said this to me. which you can all laugh about because I like to make lawyer jokes. But I was studying for the bar exam, and I was commenting to someone who'd already passed, like, I've talked to all these people in my class. They're all doing better than I am. They're scoring higher than I am. They're working more, practice exams than I am. Like, I'm really nervous. And she looked at me and she goes, yeah, because they're lying. And it had never crossed my mind that people would lie about this, like, because I just wouldn't. And not because I wouldn't lie or I'm some perfect person. Everybody has, their vices. Rather, I just wouldn't lie about that. Like, that wasn't something that I would, like, that was too serious. Like, I wanted to be able to take people's data and use that information as a barometer. And it was one of those things that I've always had to remember when working, whether at the IRB, the sites, the sponsor, the CRO, of anytime someone says you're the most expensive, anything hyperbole, right? You're the most expensive. Your IRB is taking the longest to open this study. You're taking the longest to negotiate this contract. I mean, every now and again, maybe every once in, 7,000, it is true. You have some cog in your wheel and you need to investigate. But the other 6,999 times, you're being pressured. And I'm not pointing fingers. That comes from all sides. Let's be very clear.
Mm-hmm.
Like, everybody's pressuring everybody. There's a downstream and an upstream there. But I just always tell people, as a matter of course, anytime someone gives you too good to be true results, like some other massive academic medical center's IRB approved this protocol in less than 2 weeks since submission, like, lie. Like, that's where I'm going to press the BS button real quick and go, okay, sure. Can you just send me their approval paperwork? I just need to check it. I mean, like, come on. And I think that's a great place to start. Yeah. Well, it's a great place to start this conversation. For me, I always like to root the conversation to fair market value, like I said in my interview, on, like, I understand the legal principle behind it. I do. And there is reason for concern. As with all of our regulations, we are reactive. So if nothing bad had ever happened in this venue or this arena, we wouldn't have to have a whole lot of regulations and compliance around it now, would we? Mm-hmm. But having said that, that doesn't mean everyone's a bad actor. And that doesn't mean we're not totally exploiting this. And so I think it's wildly validating for someone who's on all sides as a consultant, someone who's, all finance all the time, primarily inside a major academic medical center, and then someone who's got that site perspective, you know what I mean? Like, all of us to kind of come back and keep saying the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's actually pushed some motion. I mean, what do you guys think? I think it's actually, like, I've seen some positive responses.
I do want to get to Eric, but I have to tell you, Wenoah and Edye, I have actively sent the link to that podcast, specifically Edie's clip and those two negotiators during a negotiation. And it deflates their entire argument on fair market value because they realize who they're talking to. Someone who they've investigated fair market value. Your definition has no relevance on me. My favorite correlation across here is that each and every one of you agreed there is no fair market value standard. So the standard that is presented to us during negotiations is frankly a bunch of BS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, well, like Wenoah was saying too, it says, am I the only one? Am I crazy? It's professional gaslighting to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. Come on. All the other cool sites are doing it. Come on. Just take this low budget.
Isn't that amazing how that doesn't change from, like, kindergarten? Like we're still
he took my candy. Yeah.
Right? Like, he got a bigger donut than I did.
Not fair.
Like, I find that interesting in the human element of all of this, that's still such a principle. But I also think that you wouldn't see organizations use that tense point or that pain point if it didn't work.
Yeah. So I wonder how many sites are being pressured into accepting things that are not fair and, in fact, very underfunded. Eric, you're the only one we didn't get to hear from. So when you listen
you've
to
been
all
too quiet, Eric. Come on, this is not like you.
Well, I would just say, Wenoah, you can't be the most expensive because we are. We at IU are absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Right there.
I don't know. I got 5 sites who are all the most expensive on my roster.
And listening to that podcast, it kind of affirmed my daily affirmations. You're not crazy. You're not the only one that has it. Like, everybody has this problem, and sponsors just throw it out so willy-nilly. Like, you're the most expensive, and fair market value. And every time that I've asked, like, show me your fair market value, crickets. I get nothing. Show me how you came to that. I get nothing. And if you take that to any other industry, you don't have that as a response when you're negotiating anything. If you're looking at buying a car, you're looking at buying a house, you find out fair market value with data to support it. And you never get that from sponsors. And that's what's probably my biggest frustration with all of it.
Well, it's completely paywalled. Let's just look at this real quick. Benchmarking is a big business. There are companies that make a ton of money off of data that's completely inaccurate.
Right.
Or maybe not inaccurate. Maybe it was accurate about 20 years ago. But it's definitely not something that you want to base future budgets off of.
Well, and I think this gets back to the heart of like, I was having this conversation in a very unrelated venue yesterday, and I actually said at the time, like, it's very interesting to see the opinions of this particular subset of people of how sponsors are organized, because it wasn't necessarily site facing, it wasn't necessarily sponsor, it was people who are a bit removed from the industry, looking at it from a very different lens. And so it was just very interesting for them to see, to have such great respect for, but also be a bit confused by some of the organization points or pain points that we see, whether it be, communication, siloing within these large sponsors and organizations, inability to speak from one department to another, even though you're in the same organization. And it gets to the heart of what, we've talked about in terms of fair market value of not only is the data potentially old and outdated in what you're using, not transparent, which it just seems to be problematic. And I agree with Eric. I mean, we work in a regulated industry. Anytime an auditor says to me, I'm going to make a finding, I'm not even necessarily disagreeing with it, but the first thing I'm going to say is, can you point me to the regulation? Can you point me to where that interpretation is? Probably so I can learn. Probably so I know what's coming next, right? Even if I think we did something wrong. So when you can't point me to your database, when you can't share anything, and I understand certain parts are proprietary, but there's ways to get around that if you'd like to be creative enough to do so. And so you can't show me anything transparent. You can't, one department can't seem to talk to another. So even if I've worked with this sponsor before in a different type of study, that doesn't translate across the line into a different therapeutic area or a different, locale or regionally displaced office. So like it almost kind of makes me not envious of those who are trying to navigate the sponsor who are at the sponsor, right? Like this does not sound like a really easy organizational infrastructure to actually get a lot of things done within, to be frank. And I know Eric knows that pain. Anytime you're at a large organization, you're just not as nimble and it's harder. So I'm not picking on sponsors or anyone else for that matter, but it's just very interesting to see that even though we see all these hallmarks of things that in other, and you make this point a lot, Dr. Fox, these hallmarks of things you see in other business activities that we'd never agree to. You'd never buy a car like this. You'd never buy a house like this. You'd never agree to these other business relationships like this. You'd never agree to like your job and your benefits and your compensation like this. And yet this is the backbone of how we're funding research sites, whether you're as large as an IU or a very small, mom and pop clinical practice. And that's the part I don't understand. Like it goes back to, and everyone's heard me say this on some podcast about something because it's my like North Star, but why in a completely data-driven business are we doing anything without data?
That's exactly what
we have such an obscene amount of data in this world and an obscene amount of ways of extrapolating it and analyzing it. Why would we not use the data, no matter who you are? Sponsor, CRO, site, we're all guilty of this, okay? Like across the board. Yeah. Why would you not use that data to analyze and understand, okay, in these settings, we believe, and we have this data to justify why fair market value is higher or lower than in these settings, based on the following variables. I mean, it's not the easiest thing to track. I'm not saying there's not a lift involved. But if you had the right mindset, if you had the right intelligence, and, even something as rudimentary as, I don't know, an Excel spreadsheet, I feel like this is something we could do. Like we can cure cancer. Surely we can do this. And then establish that. I mean, you're basically doing that with CRPN in a way, like, you're building to that, but like, and give really hard variables. Like, look, yes, it is a different price to do research with a major school of medicine than it is with a freestanding research site. You also get different catchment areas and different patients. So for different therapeutic areas, there's clear reasons why one case is better than the other. Like, I don't understand. What do you guys think about that? Have you guys seen any movement on that front?
Oh my gosh,
Dr. Fox?
Wenoah, it's so many things sparked up in your interview, and I'll let you speak to it, but your comparison of the different types of informed consent based off of the complexity of the trial versus your the scarcity where you are versus where the big city. Would you be willing to elaborate on what Edie was talking about?
I think, Edie, to your point, this idea that we're drowning in data, but somehow we can't use any of the data to inform the decisions that we're being asked to make on a regular basis, or how to, engage in fair and transparent negotiations that are based in data. We wouldn't accept data from a study without visibility into how we arrived at those conclusions. So for somebody to suggest that the conclusion is that I should be willing to accept this much money to do this particular task or to execute this particular procedure is really insanely frustrating. And I'm currently engaged in a number of negotiations right now for some really exciting trials. We do a lot of HIV work, but we also, we'll do phase 1 intense PK, where patients spend 12 hours in the clinic, 14 hours in the clinic. And we do studies where you come in and we give you an additional nasal swab when you come in to test a device for COVID. And do you understand how to execute this COVID test in a home-like setting, right? And the conversation Dr. Fox and I had was this idea that the idea that somebody is going to tell me how much I should charge for an informed consent when it's going to require 6 pages and 1 additional nasal swab versus a 39-page informed consent that is going to involve a participant changing their medication to 2 new investigational products, including a novel delivery system that is going to require multiple infusions and or injections. And there is going to be a level of complexity and duration of the trial that has no bearing whatsoever on what an informed consent process looks like for the nasal swab. So when we had this conversation with the CRO, they said fair market value for an informed consent in the United States is this much. And our bandwidth is to go up to 111% of what that fair market value is. And so you're so far outside of that bandwidth that there's no possible way for us to even consider negotiating. And I said, I'd really like to speak to the sponsor because I don't understand how you can tell me that this is how much money I have to pay an unlicensed medical professional to have a conversation with a participant that is going to last in excess of an hour, hour and a half, to explain all of the potential risks and benefits, and then assume that I'm going to be able to have somebody agree to do that for less than $100.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, from the regulatory perspective, like not just the nice to have, it is the expectation
absolutely
of GCP, FDA, IRB, and any similar adjacent body outside of the United States where other research occurs, that you are, in fact, spending that type of time walking through in a meaningful capacity with a patient. And I mean, Eric and I both know we lived in oncology together. I mean, those consents start at 45 pages. Start. And even if the patient looks at you and goes, I don't care what you tell me in this consent I'm signing, like I feel like this is my only option, you are still ethically bound. And I mean, this has implications for your license, for your certifications, not to mention just your moral compass, to have that conversation. And so where I take issue with that is not only the data part of it, right? Where how can you tell me what it costs? What variables are you basing this on? What information and data do you have to suggest that? But even if we got a transparent model, I guarantee you that transparent model will be based on the idea that a consent was not going to be an open conversation with the patient. It would be widgeted, right? It would be cut down to you have 12 minutes to deliver this consent. And that flies in the face of regulation. very, 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 very clearly. Now, I'm not saying the sponsors are making a direct connection or that that's what they're trying to do. Again, this isn't like a sponsor shade pod. This is more of exploring the connections there and where that creates multiple layers of problems.
So
To the
I've got
sponsor's credit in that conversation, once we had the sponsor involved in the conversation,
they were fine.
The sponsor was like, well, no, I want you to take the time. This is the foundation of the work we do. It is the bedrock of participation in the clinical trial, your informed consent process. So with a 39-page consent for a study that involves this many logistics and this length of time, we then will send in the coordinator to help the participant understand what they are committing to. This is how many visits this is going to require. In our particular setting, most of the time, our participants are traveling upwards of 40 or 50 miles in each direction. So a simple blood draw visit is not, me popping into an Uber and Ubering 12 minutes across town and spending 20 minutes at the site. This is somebody taking half a day or a day off of work, even if it's for a simple blood draw, targeted physical review of adverse events and concomitant medication. That potentially is going to take one of our phase 2 studies. I think our participant drives 4 hours in each direction for every visit.
Yep, that's what we do here. We've got you have people taking overnights. They have to just take a weekend, pretty much take 3 days to do it. I had a follow-up question, especially on the data, and this is for Eric. Eric, to your knowledge, when it comes to the development of fair market value, right? Do people ever look back and validate the data from the negotiated contracts? Or is it always just churn and burn, make the contract move forward? We never really check to see if it actually paid the bills.
Well, I think that's where this conversation is kind of hitting on some that exact topic of the data's there. It's just held in such a micro fashion. Each site has data. Like I recently had a sponsor from one of our study teams that said that they never include a certain administrative fee in their budget negotiations. We've never done that. Well, I've got 16 contracts with you from the past that says that you do. So
you caught him, huh?
And
you caught him.
And I think the whole conversation here is the data is there, but there's too many different sets of fair market value. I look at what is fair market for my site. I look at, with this specific sponsor, this is what we've negotiated in the past. This is what I expect to get in a contract moving forward with them. Then sponsors are doing the same. And if we look at the bigger conversation of like, if sites were to get together and discuss these things and even bring that data all together just from a site's perspective, they're then colluding, and sponsors and CROs have a really good case against them for colluding to potentially raise the price of research for industry sponsors. So we need something that brings all of this data, all these different data points, all the past contracts that we've signed, all together to where we can work together. And I think that's the biggest issue that I've seen in the contracts and budgets that I've negotiated, is that it never feels like the sponsor wants to work together with us. They want to throw that you're the most expensive and fair market value out there. But when we try having that conversation and we try to even bring other sites we know that are doing the same study into the conversation, it ends, or it gets more contentious at that point. And then we have all these legalities that we have to worry about with not intentionally raising the price of research for industry. And that just gets so convoluted. And the conversation here with the ambiguity of these trials, there's very few 2 clinical trials that are exactly the same. And there's more effort being put in depending on the trial, depending on the site, how old the site is. If it's a small new research site that we see, coming and going all over the place, they don't have the experience and the knowledge on how to do this without just saying, "Yeah, sponsor, you're correct. Let's just take that." And then they're in trouble after the study starts, where they're not getting funded enough to cover their expenses. And there's just so much with this conversation that we can go so far. And there's so much that.
Well, and I wonder, like, how do you get it? How do you get it to a point where, I think we're all in firm agreement that, just throwing shade or venting and bitching is not enough, and it's not the goal, right? Like, the goal is true collaboration and resolution of an active problem. So when we look at it from that lens, it makes me think about other processes in the regulatory lens that you see sponsors or CROs do very differently or approach very differently, in the sense of, like, think about INDs. They will spend an exorbitant amount of money and time and great resources knowing the value prop that has, knowing the power that has, and knowing the scrutiny it's going to receive, right? So it has some hold, it has some dynamic to create a different approach by the sponsor that then even gets pushed to the CRO. Like, there's a level of expectation there. And so, like, to me, it's how do we liken this issue? How do we become adjacent? How do we reroute that pathway at the sponsor level to say, look, we think you're listening. We think you hear us. We are not, like you said, Eric, we do not want to drive up the price of research. No one here, it's not what this is about. This is, no one's trying to, like, drive a fancier car, buy a bigger house here. That's not what this is about. This is about truly getting paid in a fashion that will allow us to conduct good quality research, and also impact our local site ecosystem, whether that is, stopping turnover, having better equipment, doing better recruitment for a better catchment area, offering patients more resources. It could be a multitude of really great things that don't just benefit the site, benefit the patients, the sponsor, the relationship, the community at large. So how do we elevate this topic and create more than just an outcry, more than just I think at this point you've got enough rebel rousing in the industry that you've got people listening. Like at SOS, we obviously saw sponsors and CROs attending and having these conversations in really meaningful ways, but it wasn't categorical. Do you know what I mean? I still felt very like this one sponsor is listening, but maybe not these others, or like this one department at this one large company has heard what we've had to say and they've been great to work with, but we know the whole company hasn't adopted necessarily. And so, like, that's where I see the opportunity to liken.
Yeah, Edie, I think the missing piece is the oversight. Like, you talk about INDs, IDEs, there's oversight with the FDA on how, where there's some...
but who would oversee this, though?
Right.
I mean, where would this be, like a Federal Trade Commission thing, or I mean, that's FTC. But
the only way you've gotten it so far is CMS, and that's because you've got Medicare, Medicaid acting
Better
as
Business
patient
Bureau.
Insurance.
So I guess
what about if we turned it into a study? What about if we turned it into a study?
Let's do a back-to-back. I love it, Wenoah.
Let's do
real data.
Anonymize the data, right? Anonymized data. Yeah. Your site gets a site ID, right, that nobody sees, and you are completing your ECRFs with the data. It's completely anonymous. There's no collusion because we're not like nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Eric, what are you guys getting at your large academic center? And over here in New Mexico, where, we can't find, I have literally got the only infectious disease provider in this region. We are now our local.
You're on to something, Wenoah. That's so.
What if we anonymized the data and did a study?
What if you create a safe place? And so here's something that gets me is the whole fair market value thing is it kind of shows the cards of the sites on how much profit they make or how much margin they make. If you do like really show how much the true costs of the research are, you kind of show your cards on your margin. But what if you were to create a safe place where sites could be anonymized? I mean, we tokenize patients all the time. Let's do it for sites. Let's let sites go into a true fair market value study, like Wenoah was saying, where we can bring up all of the standard things you see on a contract, and they can really go through and do a thorough cost assessment, combine it into a pool, into a safe place, create an average where you're not breaking the law or confidentiality because it's an average, it's a culmination, and then compare that to the contracts. We don't have access to Grant Plan, but I guarantee you we have access to all kinds of contracts that supposedly came from Grant Plan.
And we can stratify data, right?
That's what I was just about to say is if you could stratify it based on, are we in a more metro or rural location? What type of research site centers are we attached to or not? Exactly. Therapeutic area.
I will publish that with you because I know that you are right, Wenoah. Being in a rural area does not mean your costs are lower. I guarantee it.
No.
It's like, you know what?
Not at all.
What happens when you walk into a convenience store? When you walk into a convenience store, are the prices lower?
Nope. Never.
Guess why?
Scarcity.
Because
it's convenient.
Yeah. It's a convenient.
Because you don't have to go all the way to Walmart. That's the
Yeah.
point.
So that same thing with rural areas. You know
Well,
how
Costco.
hard it is to keep specialists in a cornfield?
I literally,
Well-
our hospitals in northern New Mexico have now outsourced infectious disease providers
Mhm.
to telemedicine. And I will tell you,
Wow.
having worked in infectious disease for a very long time, that outsourcing your infectious disease specialist to somebody on a screen is a
Yeah.
completely
That's exactly
different
where-
value proposition from a patient care perspective.
Good
I
luck
think-
doing C. diff with that. Wenoah.
Right. Well, and I think the other piece of it is
That's
when you talk about reimbursement and you talk about the distinction between how this informed, and I'll use the informed consent example. So if I'm going in to have my teeth cleaned, I am 1000% comfortable with the dental assistant conducting my informed consent discussion, right? The risk and benefit of having my teeth cleaned is I don't like having my teeth cleaned. I don't like the scraping. I really like how I feel afterwards, but the risk benefit pretty nominal. I have had multiple dental surgeries where I require anesthetic. I busted all my teeth out mountain biking. And I will tell you that my informed consent discussion with the surgeon and the anesthesiologist probably cost my provider more than the informed consent discussion for my
The teeth cleaning. Yep.
And so
Mhm.
the idea that somebody would put the cost of the surgeon and the anesthesiologist versus the dental assistant into a bucket, shake it up, and come up with an average and say, well, you can never charge us more for having the dental surgeries than you would to have your teeth cleaned is ludicrous. And I
Yep.
think
Well,
that
and this is played out in clinical billing. I mean, there are avenues and ways that accommodate this. Why we wouldn't borrow, I'm not suggesting that our healthcare system isn't broken and that we shouldn't reinvent it in a myriad of ways, different pod. But if we can learn from some things we do actually understand about how this works, we should at a minimum understand the demographic or the details behind the different demographics of employing high qualified personnel in different medical settings. Anyone who's tried to be a chief medical officer in a rural setting and tried to bring in really high quality talent knows you are looking at, paying off debt. You are looking at helping people buy a house. You are wining and dining. You are spending a pretty penny trying to talk folks into coming to either that location, that hospital. Maybe you're in the middle of, West Virginia. And so your opioid substance abuse issues are huge. Maybe it's that it's just not a very attractive place to live. Maybe it's, there's a myriad of different
I will
things.
tell you, I never had any difficulty recruiting somebody to an infectious disease practice in Beverly Hills.
Although,
Right.
They're
Wenoah,
tripping over themselves.
wouldn't it be something? I have never had a sponsor wine and dine me to take their trial. Wouldn't that be something?
Right.
I mean, come on.
So that's where I think it's just one of those. I think that if you don't understand that is happening behind the scenes just for everyday care and just to literally have enough providers at your facility to safely be open and seeing patients and or not have to go on a divert, which is a really big problem in rural settings, then you're not going to translate that to this issue. Do you know what I mean? Like you're not going to go like, okay, if this issue exists here, it's only magnified in this particular setting.
So I did want to take a minute. So we've got some live engagements and we're already 34 minutes in. I'm so sorry, Jeff. So Jeff says, I mean, you might be crazy, but not for this reason. Thanks a lot, Jeff. That's
that's very accurate, Jeff. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out.
Valena. Yeah. Amen, Valena. So still waiting on GM and GP to join the podcast to enlighten us.
Grants manager, right? I mean, that's where you would expect those things to be tracked, those costs, those expenses.
Grant manager, grant plan. Yeah. So how's that going? Why are the data different? Why is this? They're never going to come because there's going to be like supposed egg on their face. But I mean, come on. This is an industry where we have data. Well, we have some data and it's paywalled. So it's not transparent. Going back, I don't know if you saw my clip today on fair market value, but United States Cartwright, 1973. It's right there. We talked about it. There is a true Supreme Court ruling on the definition of a fair market value. And you can see how many different ways this does not, what we see right now in clinical research does not align with the interpretation of fair market value.
Well, and I don't understand how, even with the definition, if there's no transparency, how are we arriving? So in these negotiations I'm currently engaged in, I have said I need the procedures table to be able to calculate what my costs for actually conducting the trial are going to be. What we are now seeing is this trend toward visit-only totals for compensation. We don't care how much you provide as a stipend. It's not our problem. Absorb the cost of the mileage, not our problem. This is what we're going to pay you. We're not going to tell you what's involved in the visits. We're just going to give you a lump sum for each visit.
So they've gotten away from itemization, Edie, and more into lump sums, a bit completely opaque, and they never tell you how they got to that.
And so I have now
it's like flat fee recruitment that they've been doing for a while. That just drives me nuts. Like, at what point in any negotiation in your entire life, like anything, buying a car, going to the store to buy your groceries later today, whatever, have you literally purchased something for a flat fee?
Well, and
it was accurate.
Well, if I go to the grocery store and I have 17 items on the till, they just give me a flat fee. They just tell me, well, that's going to be $87. Well, how on earth did you get to $87? How the hell did you get that? And they're going to say, oh, no, that's none of your business.
It reminds me of a flea market. Have you ever done that at flea market? You put all the stuff on the table and they're like, $5. Garage sale. They do that at garage sales, you know?
And you're like, no, $2.
Let's haggle, right?
Well, let me just peel off this complete physical, and we'll peel off this infusion, and I can get you down to $87. Right?
And they're like, that's against protocol. How are you going to do that, Wenoah?
It's deviation, right?
I think that opacity, right? That refusal, in this negotiation right now, I have now made 3 formal requests. I have provided you with transparency into how I arrived at this. This is my actual true cost of executing these procedures. And please demonstrate to me how you arrived at it. Well, we cloned your last budget. I call bullshit. I'm not supposed to swear on this. Sorry, Dan.
No, you're fine.
I call baloney, right? Like there's no way that you cloned
you
my
can't have me on a podcast and I don't drop something.
No, that's fine.
You're fine, Wenoah.
But I think, they have consistently refused on multiple negotiations to provide any visibility into how they arrived at the numbers. So now we have gotten into a process of unraveling the budget, the procedures table, where we've realized that they have the procedures table that we're provided is an Excel spreadsheet. And there's this handy function on an Excel spreadsheet where you can hide rows and you can hide columns. And so you have to untangle, you have to copy and paste the Excel spreadsheet into another one to see which rows and columns they've hidden. So they have now eliminated any of the, they've bundled all of your clinical work. So your coordinators, your research assistants, your investigators, all of that is one lump fee, right? Behind that lump fee, they've broken it all out.
They don't show you.
Data entry, chair fees, physical exams, all of that is getting hidden into these rows. And then they come up with this total where they refuse to provide you with the numbers that allowed them to arrive at what they're offering. So they just say, it doesn't matter. This is what we're offering. This is what the visit totals are. And so without any transparency, it becomes impossible. It's like arguing with a 3-year-old, and no disrespect intended to CROs. You can't just say this is the total because I said so. That's right. Not a logical argument. And so if I have to show you mine to justify, you continue to ask me to justify my costs, then you have to show me yours to justify where you're offering me so much less than what I know the work is worth.
It's definitely one way. It's one way.
We saw that at the SOS conference too, Wenoah, where there was the gentleman from one of the sponsors that was like, going on about, all this justification that he's asking and having trouble getting it. But there was never any, we'll give you we're going to give you all of our justification for what we're charging. And in your scenario, Wenoah, and at first I do want to say, I thought you were going to say with all respect to 3-year-olds, but
I did too.
But in this situation, and it puts you as a budget negotiator in a horrible position to have to go back to your PI and your coordinators and the researchers that really want this really good study that's going to be great for them, great for your patients, great for the overall healthcare of your area, and say to them, we may have to walk away from this because financially we cannot do this study.
Yep. Or what's worse, Eric, is they'll time punish you. And that's another really big thing. So you actually try to get your fair market value, and what they'll do, they'll put you on a shelf somewhere, and they'll say, oh, it's with the sponsor. It's with the sponsor because they think you're too valuable or too much. And then you're punishing your participants and your PI and your entire site with time. That's where they're going to get you. It's like, if you don't accept what we offer you, we're just going to delay you, stall you, and then you're just not going to have the opportunity. So where is that?
I've had multiple sponsors come back to me because we work with medical leadership, particularly on some of these complex studies, and say, Wenoah, we're still waiting for your budget. I'm like, I call bullshit. They've had my budget for 10 days and have refused to respond to it. What we also encounter, with the FDA's guidance a few years ago about ensuring that there is representation in clinical trials. Everybody is interested. How many of this particular demographic can you enroll in my study? And what we have tried to describe and explain is that you can't helicopter into a community and say, I want 3 women and I want 4 people of color and I want 2 transgender community members, and then helicopter out of the community when the study
We are not short order cooks here.
That's exactly
not what
it.
this is. That's not how this works.
Right.
So when we have tried to communicate the idea that for us to be able to engage those communities requires access to the history and the relationships that we have built. So we routinely travel 2 or 3 hours, 4 hours, in some cases longer, to community sites to talk to people about clinical research, so that before we are ever entering the community with a study to offer them. And somehow this is a cost that we are expected to absorb. And so we end up in this argument all the time around, well, you guys did not deliver on the diverse community members that we wanted represented. And the example I will use is that in a budget negotiation, when we got shelved because we were being difficult, the CRO had made a decision to decline the translation for the Hispanic community. They refused to translate, to use the Central IRB's translation service. And in a competitively enrolling trial that only has 75 participants worldwide, if you add 9 weeks to the informed consent development because you're going to use your own special vendor, the study's been closed for 5 weeks by the time you get me that informed
you
consent.
lost your diversity. You lost your access to that diversity.
That negotiation, because we were going back and forth and you've insisted that we're asking for too much for the communities we serve, knowing that it requires a very specific amount of resources to access those communities. Now we've been shelved because we're not enrolling those participants. We're not negotiating well enough, but now we can no longer enroll those participants because the budget negotiation has become contentious. So I think that the implications of this argument or discussion has implications for the sponsor. I was at the investigator meeting for the phase 3 version of the study, and they were complaining about the fact that they had not met their FDA reported diversity goals. And they said, well, if we'd only had 2 more Hispanic participants and 1 more female. And I was absolutely practically jumping out of my seat. I had 6 participants, 2 of whom were female, and all of whom were Hispanic, who were denied access to the trial because during the budget negotiation, they didn't believe that this merited their attention. So I feel like the implications in real life of these issues or this dispute around what fair market value is have downstream implications that sponsors don't necessarily see because they're not part of the negotiation.
They're so disconnected. And that goes back to that one about the informed consent. Wenoah, you said when you started talking to the sponsor was like, well, of course we want you to do this. So there was a decision made that the sponsor at least didn't fully approve or was not privy to. That was completely derailing the entire process.
Oh, and the sponsor, like I said, comes back to us. We did a vaccine trial where they said, well, of course you had access to Spanish language consents. 7 weeks after the study's enrollment closed, we received the IRB approved informed consent because we were so busy arguing about who was going to pay for it.
Yeah.
So who's going to pay for the translation? So I think that fair market value in a very narrow sense in terms of the definition is an important conversation. But I think the bigger conversation about transparency and implications for participants and for sites and for sponsors, they talk about 80% of sites or 80% of studies don't achieve their enrollments, or they have delays in enrollments. Those are related to these delays in negotiations and the back and forth as a result. And I just struggle with understanding how we get to a different place where this conversation.
Well, because some of it is also going back to like that organizational part. Like I could totally see individuals at the sponsor, at the CRO, who frankly agree with everything we've said so far, completely are nodding their heads out there in the audience, 46 minutes in, going, you don't understand, I don't have the power to make this happen. Or you don't understand, this isn't the way we're structured. Or you don't understand, this is not how we're put together. This is not how we interact. This is not how we communicate. This is not our main goal. This isn't a priority. Any number of reasons. And if we were in that organization, we may even have some empathy and go like, oh yeah, they do have these other competing priorities. Like I get it, I understand. But again, it goes back to, okay, but how do you understand this is one of the highest priorities for the downstream impact of your trial? Like the sites very desperately need this in a different way. It may not be the highest priority of the sponsor or the CRO, fair enough, but it is one of the highest priorities for your partners that you need, your critical action partners that you need. And so, how do we come to some meeting in the middle, some list of variables or uniform standard, like Eric and I were talking about earlier, that pushes that notion of we're going to have some amount of accountability. We know that, in certain demographics, this is slightly more expensive or slightly cheaper, and we're going to accommodate for that. But generally speaking, as an industry, we've come to agree that this price range for this is appropriate. And actually all accept and listen to that. Do you know what I mean? Like have some carrot stick situation that makes it so that you want to do. Sorry, we've got a comment. I was looking here.
Yep.
All of these problems would not be up for discussion if data.
Yep. We're going back to grant manager, grant plan.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't understand that.
That's the key.
Like, here's my thing is that there's a couple of different things. One, I get really tired, and I know I'm like a privacy person and an attorney, so I'm supposed to stand in this camp firmly, but I just don't. I believe that if you really want to find a way to communicate the most critical variables while still protecting the sensitivity of your data, we have extraordinary ways to do that, because I do work with clients who do really care about being compliant, but also really do need to use data from participants in studies to, change the services they provide, write a better protocol next time, whatever it is they're into or that they do. And we find ways to do it every day of the week. So the notion that it's so proprietary, the notion that we can't share information in any way or format is just a foregone conclusion for me. It can't be that proprietary. I also think there's an upstream argument here to be made around, and this was something I was thinking about when you were talking about all the translations, Wenoah. I'll say this and I'll shut up, but so at what point do you get to, no matter if you're the site, the CRO, the sponsor, and we know it happens downstream, but in an upstream fashion, at what point do you get to say, really, you took 9 weeks to translate something into Spanish? Like ChatGPT could have done that in 5 minutes. And you argued about whatever, $100 difference, a $500 difference. I don't care. The point is that I, downstream, don't want to have to pay for your inefficiencies upstream, because I know this could be done better. I know there's an app for that, or a process for that, or a workaround for that. And so it needs to go both directions. I mean, like the whole time you're talking about this translation argument, I'm thinking in the time she lays out this example, AI would have
It would have done it.
freaking consent translated perfectly.
And then we could have
Like, are you
consented
kidding me?
And this goes
Like,
back
that's
to
just the
Disconnect.
dumb.
this will be my my
Yes.
hill. But at independent contractors, that's my big thing. Everyone hates the word independent contractors. Nobody has a good agreement on the definition. But any other economy, any other business, you have the consumer and you have the provider. The consumer has one choice and only one choice, and that is whether or not to spend money. Everything else is owned by that provider. You don't walk into a hospital as a patient and say, I'm only going to pay you this much for that aspirin or for that medicine or for that procedure.
Yeah.
The patients
Fix
do
my leg.
not have that control. Go into a burger joint. Try telling the burger joint you're only going to spend $1 on a burger. See what happens. They're going to say, thank you very much,
Right.
next. That's where we're going to have to get to on a site level. So for one thing, Wenoah, is we have tried for decades to fix this. And we have done it by relying on the consumers to create the costs. The same people who have no idea what the actual costs are. Now, they try it as a baseline, they do that, but it is up to the sites. This is not collusion. This is not creating a union of fixed pricing. This is having very educated providers coming together to create cost basis that is realistic to the actual cost of performing something. That's the only way fair market value is actually going to pay the bills. And I would love to hear grant manager and grant plan talk about that.
Yeah, well, to that point too, with grant manager being inaccurate, and that's where building transparent budgets comes from, and a true positive effort, as the previous comment mentioned. But the information's not accurate, then you're already at a loss, right? You're not starting where you need to be. So it definitely creates those challenges. As we've had these discussions throughout the week, we've recently had negotiations. We talked with sites last week as well, and what we hear from sites is that at a certain point they're like, well, we're just gonna accept this as it is, and eat a cost here or there, hopefully a small cost for recruitment or whatever it may be. It's just they get to a certain point where, we're just gonna do it.
You get to the point where you decide which is the hill I'm going to die on.
Yeah,
exactly.
Or you're just
what is the hill I'm going to die on?
I can't tell you how many sites just give up. The CROs drag the negotiation so long. You see patients suffering, and you're like, you know what? Fine, whatever. We'll just do it for this lower rate. We'll eat the cost because we need to help our patients every single time. And it's just, I like what Edie said. Who can withstand the negotiation longer? That's who wins. And I guarantee you, it's not the patient. Because sites are going up against deeper pockets. CROs really don't have skin in the game. They're going to finish this and then go on to screw the next site. There is no accountability. There's nothing in there about the quality of performance. It's all about the waiting game. And in the end, it's the patient that loses.
True. But and to add to that too is, from the sponsor side and the CRO side, you're paying for all these vendor services. The longer you keep those negotiations going and open, if you could make them 8 weeks shorter because you're not drawing it out, your study's potentially closing 2 months sooner. That's huge cost saving potential right there.
And to all of you
That's
sponsors,
admittedly one of the things I've never understood about sponsors. Like CROs to me are a very different model than what we're talking about specifically in this. But like, if I'm a sponsor, and I'm staring down the barrel of how much you have to spend on R&D to get one test article to really go the distance and make that blockbuster, not only in patients' lives, but let's face it, it's a business. You're talking about a minimum of a $1 billion investment in hopes that one test article gets out there. And you're going to have to do that hundreds, if not thousands of times. It is extraordinarily expensive. I do not envy their position whatsoever. But if I'm them and I'm running the helm, I'm running that like Bezos and Amazon. You better believe I'm going to be tight. I'm going to know where we are, hemorrhaging money, where we could be more efficient. And I'm not talking about, bonuses and let's, never give our employees raises or be some terrible management team. I'm talking about exactly what you just said, Mitch, which is, where are we using a CRO that's costing us more money than they're saving us? Where do we have a vendor that is just not cutting it for us anymore. And we've given them several chances, and it's time to move on to a different process. When was the last time our tech and innovation team actually brought us tech and innovation that we're utilizing, right? We're not just evaluating something that, we can pull the trigger on. And how do we also enable, even though we're a really large company, fair enough, but how do we enable arms of the company at a minimum, or leadership, to be nimble enough to not have to go through 6 months of negotiation and vendorization when you need that resource today, right? When your team is asking you for it, you evaluated it, you've decided it's a great vendor for what you need. Maybe it's an even better deal than what you've been getting, more quality, lower price. And then you sent them to the lawyers where they lived for 9 months, and they went over and over and over and redlined indemnity clauses and all sorts of other things that, again, relevant, wouldn't have to do it if we didn't have a litigious society, that sets that precedent. But how can I, as leadership at that company, enable or better guide my compliance and legal departments around where I'm willing to take some appetite for risk so that we can move more nimbly, and also where I'm not, where that's just not, we're going to have to take our sweet time. And if it is taking 9 months to negotiate, why am I not tracking that turnaround time? Why do I not understand every phase of it? Why am I not exploring that metric with my team to understand? Because even if that turnaround time was 3 months, which is great, I still would rather it be 2. And when it's 2, I'd rather it be 1. I mean, who doesn't want better and better metrics? You always want to be tracking and trending so that you're improving. And again, this is an organization that has an immense amount of data, an immense amount of resources. So it always shocks me a bit because I know what they're working on is expensive. I would think if you could save 5 or 6 figures here, there, and everywhere, you'd want to. You'd want to cut dead weight.
And it feels like a void. So it's like you said,
yeah,
we're
I don't
in this
get it.
world of data, and it just seems like this giant black hole, a money sink that nobody is really looking at correctly.
Yeah.
And
it just seems weird. And it just seems, like I said, it's always interesting to me. I have rarely sat down with someone from a sponsor or CRO, I'll say on the record, who will go, yeah, we've got some work to do. We know it. Versus every site-facing person I know, whether they're a consultant, a contractor, a vendor, site owner, coordinator, the minute you bring this issue up is like, oh yeah, we got problems. And so that's just a very interesting dynamic to me, that we're very honest about it in one space, and yet in another, it's like, no, we're not going to talk about that.
Mm-hmm. So actually, we're hours up. I called it. We could talk for 3 more. Let's go ahead and wrap it up. I'm going to hand each of you the microphone. If you would like to tell anyone in this industry something about fair market value, what would you say? Wenoah, let's start with you.
I'm just going to keep beating the transparency drum.
Transparency. Yeah. There is no transparency. And the more you try to veil it, the more sites don't trust you. And the more this just isn't right. Something's not right. And I wish that you would include sites in even the development of this system and process. It was just this thing that was developed void of sites. You excluded sites. You said, this is what you will take sites. It almost feels like taxation without representation, if you think about it. Let's all have a giant tea party. Why not? But I agree, Wenoah. Transparency is huge. What about you, Edye, Eric?
I would add to transparency and add bridging the disconnects, and not just the disconnects between sponsors and sites, or CROs and sites, but the sponsors the disconnects within sponsors. And I think Edye kind of touched on it, where the highest level of some of these sponsors have these visions of reducing costs, and making this more pragmatic, but they don't do anything about it. And their entry level, their line staff are negotiating with us at sites, operating under a different mindset, and bridge those disconnects and transparency. And please keep patients in mind. We need these studies to be opened in some places for the patients that are potentially dying and need this treatment to not die. Keep that as your number one priority and get these open as quickly as possible.
Edye?
Yeah, everything everyone just said, and I would just, the final layer, the icing, right? The cherry on top would be, when we were doing research in the United States 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, the models were different. It's changed. We've had several huge reasons for that, right? We could spend hours discussing that. Some of it was things like COVID, exploring new modalities, but even before that, the ways in which we were selecting research sites, creating research sites, a research site's origin story is very much rooted in academia early on, right? That's the institution that we trusted. And it was very expensive to build it out of private practice. And it was even kind of laughed at initially. And yet here we are now seeing that incredible value that a variety of different types of research sites layered together create for our patients. And so in that same vein, and building on the transparency and having, you know, the call to action as sponsors to break down those barriers and those silos, similarly, I respect that a lot of these sponsors probably set up their organizational model at a time where you were interacting with the IUs of the world and they could push back. And they did have a whole office of, you know, attorneys and grant officers and contract officers who were very well versed in calling bullshit and going back and forth across the table. I know it. I did it. You know, I respect it. But the times have changed. And everyone you're negotiating with isn't in that position. And so every way in which you negotiate can't be based on that model. And so again, going back to that idea of how do we re-explore that model? And while you're rebuilding it, by the way, if you'll invest, sponsors, CROs, if you'll take that time to recognize that model may no longer be the most relevant, given our current situation and how we conduct research, I promise you a variety of research sites, whichever kinds you need to talk to, will be at the ready as the end users to say, hey, here's what we need, or here's how we see a potential future of working together, or here's where we think if you did this, you'd save money and we'd even be happier, right? So let's not recreate history in the sense of adopting a new model, but also leaving the end users out, right? Like, let's make sure we not only push for that new model, but we really build it the right way this next time around.
Mitch?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I'll just grab my
bat.
my comically large baseball bat.
I love you.
And I think
My parting words.
my takeaway, honestly, I think from here, I just want to go.
He starts bashing the keyboard.
Start writing a grant proposal based off of Wenoah's, you know, suggestion earlier on.
We should do that.
Oh,
Wenoah.
yeah.
We should publish
I'm
that.
in. Let's do it.
Study.
Yeah.
Maybe just to share the
I think the
information.
data from that would be incredibly powerful.
Yeah,
Incredibly. I mean, how do you think IRB nerds came up with a smart IRB application?
We'll share
It
with
took
grant
adoption,
managers.
it took metrics, it took data, it took studies. I mean, we're nerds. What do? We study something.
Yep.
And
If
I say
you're-
that with love. I'm right there with you, you know? Like, we
So,
study something. That's what we
Maybe
do.
do that. So maybe we can create a CRPN cohort if we want CRPN site partners to work on that, to be creating anonymous costings so that we can actually assess fair market value versus what we're being paid. That would be interesting. I did want to end with one announcement, and this goes directly with what Edye was saying. I saw it on LinkedIn, so I guess I can talk about it. CRPN's first official member sponsor, the one paying our sites to do work, is the All of Us program. So if you don't know about the All of Us program, I will share the post.
They're amazing.
It just came out today. But here's the cool thing, right? All of us came out of academia. And academia is struggling to meet their objectives. So guess where they're going now? They're going to our private sites. CRPN private sites from across the country are now launching the All of Us program so that we can get all of our communities engaged in research. That's really important to note. Please keep an eye on that. Again, I can only activate the site partners that All of Us tells me I can activate, but becoming a CRPN site partner just had much better benefits, because I will tell you the All of Us program is not the only sponsor that's looking at CRPN right now. And the cool thing, Wenoah, Edye, Eric, what you're going to love about this is we did create a way so that NIH funded trials, which are admittedly not industry rate for costs, are worthwhile for our sites because we cut the bullshit. So it's coming full circle. Just remember that. You may be getting NIH prices, but it's worth your time because of the way CRPN streamlines everything.
Congratulations.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, congrats, man. That's
Thank you.
amazing.
That was
I
a
can't
big,
wait to
big
follow
job.
that.
So,
Hell yeah, that's amazing.
oh yeah. So when you see the All of Us numbers start to spike and skyrocket in value, because frankly, they are behind on diversity and on their
Yeah.
numbers,
Hmm.
you might be seeing it be a result of the CRPN network.
And props to NIH for pivoting.
Thank you to NIH.
NIH, at least from a regulatory perspective, has always been, at least in theory, in concept, right, an initiative ahead of the curve, and an early adopter on a lot of these types of issues. Whether or not they can execute, again, large government organization, not going to hold that against them entirely here. But the concept and the individuals I've worked with there have always been very open-minded, very forward-thinking, and recognize the great deep value that sites bring, and how valuable that connection is. So I think it just says a lot about the industry that they would be.
It's changing.
That first
We
sponsor.
are looking at a pivoting change, and what you recognize the industry as right now, I don't think it's going to be like this in 5 years. I think we are on the verge of a pretty big change for how we collect our data, what we do, who has access to it. This is just the beginning. So, and fair market value is going to have to change. Sorry, all of the big companies who are making money off of really bad data, you may want to up your game because the world is changing around you. This isn't 1980 anymore. So, all right. So thank you so much for everyone for joining, watching CRPN Central. I was looking forward to this one. This was just as entertaining as the audio only podcast. And importantly, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And I'll talk to you all next time.
Thanks all.
All right. Bye, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.